All right, welcome everybody. It's great to see you all here. I think I know most of you, but just in case, my name is Father Zach Swantek, chaplain for the Aquinas Institute for Catholic Life at Princeton University. Very excited this evening to have this lecture for many reasons, but one in particular, since all of last year, all of our lectures were online and over Zoom, so it's great to be able to experience this in person. We've had many different talks at our monthly Faith on Tap at Triumph Brewery each month, but not on campus. So we're very honored to have Father Laracy with us this evening. You know, this past Monday, we celebrated the memorial of Saint Albert, who was a scientist, a theologian, and a priest, and a professor, and we know him for his most famous student, Saint Thomas Aquinas, and for whom the Aquinas Institute gets its name. And so it's great to have in this week also to have a scientist, a theologian, and a priest, and also a university professor speaking with all of us, which is a great reminder that both with faith and reason, that we are called to be saints, both as professors and as students. And so in order to introduce Father Laracy, I would like to invite Dr. Marcus Gibson, who is our director of the Princeton Initiative in Catholic Thought. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Father Zach, for that introduction. And thanks, everybody, for being here today. I'm so excited, as Father Zach said, for us all to be gathered together again in person, face-to-face, on campus. To see all of you filling the seats is such a joy and so exciting for me. I'm so excited also to be able to introduce all of you to Father Joseph Laracy, who will be speaking to us together on that relationship between faith and reason, which is dear to so many of us here at Princeton and also very much one of those hallmarks of our Catholic faith, and in particular on the relationship between science and faith, theology and physics. And so, to just give you a brief word of introduction, Father Laracy. Father Laracy is a priest of the Archdiocese of Newark and an assistant professor of systematic theology at Immaculate Conception Seminary School of Theology in Seton Hall University. And he also holds affiliations with Seton Hall's mathematics and computer science departments, the Program of Catholic Studies, the Department of the Core Curriculum, and the University Honors Program. Father Laracy earned his doctorate from the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, as well as a master's degree at MIT and a bachelor's from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. In his earlier career, his work included work for the Complex Systems Research Lab at MIT and also for the NASA Deep Impact mission. His theological interests focus on the intersection of faith and reason, as I said before, and theology and science. And in particular, he explores those issues in depth in his recent book, Theology and Science in the Thought of Ian Barbour, a Thomistic Evaluation for the Catholic Doctrine of Creation. And now to share and draw on those insights from his recent work, Father Joseph Laracy. Thank you.
It's a joy to be with you all. I'm grateful for this invitation and opportunity to speak on a topic that's very dear to my heart. And after the talk, we'll certainly have time for questions, comments, rebuttals. So I'd like to begin to provide some context and motivation for this research. In 2018, the Holy Father, Pope Francis, addressed the Vatican Observatory Summer School in Astrophysics. And he said, quote, "To know the universe, at least in part, to know what we know and what we don't know, and how we go about learning more, this is the task of the scientist. There is another way of seeing things, that of metaphysics, which acknowledges the first cause of everything, hidden from tools of measurement. There is still another way of seeing things, through the eyes of faith, which accepts God's self-disclosure. Harmonizing through these different levels of knowledge leads us to understanding, and understanding, we hope, will make us open to wisdom." End quote. In this excerpt from his address, we have another reminder from the Holy Father about the importance of harmonizing the different levels of knowledge, from the empirical sciences, metaphysics, and divine revelation, with the ultimate goal of openness to wisdom. My own journey in understanding the harmony of the natural sciences and Catholic thought began as an undergraduate at the University of Illinois. I was very fortunate to have a very significant influence on my vocational journey, as the Catholic chaplain at that time had a degree in physics from the Naval Academy. In addition, I was blessed to have a wonderful lay religion teacher, a convert from Presbyterianism, who earned a PhD in the history of science. Undergraduate research into the life and work of Monsignor Georges Lemaitre, the Belgian diocesan priest, mathematician, and physicist, who formulated the Big Bang hypothesis of the universe, was also a significant intellectual experience. My graduate studies at MIT confirmed my deep conviction that the conflict hypothesis for theology and science, that is, that the two fields make completely contradictory truth claims, was not the correct one in the Catholic intellectual tradition. Some years later, as a deacon and a priest studying fundamental theology at the Gregorian University, I was blessed to go deeper in my study of the relationship of Catholic theology and natural science. I was very fortunate to become acquainted with Father Paul Hafner, an Oxford-trained physicist turned systematic theologian. Through taking his courses and later writing 2 theses under his direction, I learned a distinctively Catholic approach to relating theology and science. In 2007, I came across an issue of the scholarly journal Theology and Science, and it was dedicated to the significant contributions made by an American physicist and Protestant theologian with whom I was unfamiliar, Ian Barbour. Ian Barbour lived from 1923 until 2013, and he was a very prominent American scholar serving for decades at Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota. His substantial research on the relationship of theology and science led to an invitation to deliver the esteemed Gifford Lectures in Scotland and won the prestigious Templeton Prize. Born in Beijing, the son of an American Episcopalian mother and a Scottish Presbyterian father, Barbour eventually found his ecclesial home in the United Church of Christ. As I began to read Barbour's works, as well as the assessments of other scholars, I realized the potential for a project in Catholic systematic theology. The highly influential German Jesuit philosopher and theologian Karl Rahner, in a 1981 essay later published in English as Natural Science and Reasonable Faith, Theological Perspectives for Dialogue with the Natural Sciences, expressed regret that in recent decades, theology has not occupied itself very intensively with borderline questions between the natural sciences and itself. As a first step toward facilitating a dialogue, Father Rahner suggests that fundamental theology must engage in a serious conversation with the natural sciences on essential epistemological issues. In addition, I would add inquiry into metaphysical issues. In light of recent magisterium, and given the scope of systematic theology to cast its gaze not merely within the confines of the Catholic Church, but to engage truth wherever it may be found, in this book I strive to carry out an extensive study in the thought of the late Professor Ian Barbour. In this research, I analyze his distinctive approach to the relationship of theology and science, largely unexplored in the Catholic tradition, according to fundamental theological criteria. My goal is to investigate the possibility for Barbour's epistemic, metaphysical, and ultimately theological principles to enrich the dialogue and integration of the Catholic doctrine of creation with the natural sciences. Barbour's corpus and contributions are vast, so I use the theology of creation as a lens or a limit to focus the research. Barbour's quest begins in an Anglophonic Protestant world, still deeply influenced by the conflict hypothesis. This conflictual framing was instigated in the 19th century by John William Draper and Andrew Dickinson White. Draper, a distinguished chemist and physician who was also virulently anti-Catholic, published the book History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science in 1874. In this book, Draper posits that the alleged conflict between religion and science in the United States was a direct result of the Catholic Church's battle against reason and science. Not surprisingly, this anti-historical work was placed on the Index of Forbidden Books in 1876. Andrew White was a historian, politician, and a co-founder of Cornell University. In 1896, he published A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom. Although baptized an Episcopalian, White became extremely hostile to any form of revealed religion. Regrettably, White's book became enormously popular in the United States and was eventually translated into German, French, Italian, Swedish, and Japanese. A History of the Warfare of Science and with Theology in Christendom greatly popularized the conflict hypothesis. Emerging as an enthusiastic young scholar in the mid-20th century, one of Barbour's goals was to revive and promote the natural sciences among American and British Protestant Christians. A foundational principle for Barbour is that theology and science are separate, truth-seeking activities that can be considered in varying forms of relationship to one another. Barbour's work in theology and science has had a profound impact on the field and stimulated scholarly work throughout the United States, the United Kingdom, and beyond. His fourfold typologies of interaction between theology and science, conflict, independence, dialogue, and integration, his development of a common epistemological approach of critical realism, and his metaphysical commitment to Alfred North Whitehead's process thought indubitably merited an evaluation according to the methods and principles of Catholic theology. Barbour's epistemic, metaphysical, and ultimately theological foundations present a challenge and an opportunity for Catholic theology. I take up this challenge in the book by drawing out how his thought might enrich Catholic theological reflection on creation. My fundamental research question is, can Ian Barbour's approach for the interaction of theology and science promote a more fruitful dialogue and integration between the natural sciences and the Catholic doctrine of creation? So now let's shift gears and talk about this notion of creation. The metaphysical concept of creation has been the subject of reflection by the most inquisitive minds since the great ancient pre-Christian civilizations to the present. It is also very germane to the contemporary theological engagement with the natural sciences. For example, two distinguished physicists, James Hartle and Stephen Hawking, developed a well-known cosmic origin hypothesis that describes a spontaneous quantum creation of the universe. In a thought experiment, Hartle and Hawking consider the Big Bang cosmic expansion in reverse. As one goes back in time, the universe contracts. Eventually, one reaches the Planck epoch, approximately 10 to the minus 43 seconds after the Big Bang, where it is not clear in what sense, if any, the concept of time retains any meaning. At this point, Hartle and Hawking theorize that particles spontaneously appear and disappear as space becomes separated from time. Hawking offers an image from everyday life as an analogy, stating that it would be a bit like the formation of bubbles of steam in boiling water. Prior to the Planck epoch, the theorized Hartle-Hawking state has no beginning because it has no initial boundaries in space and time. In the book, The Grand Design, Hawking writes that the universe can and will create itself from nothing. He says that spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing, why the universe exists, why we exist. It is not necessary to invoke God to light the blue touch paper and set the universe going. End quote. And so a Catholic may ask, what is the relationship between the creation described by Hawking, whether or not the physical theory has merit, and the teachings of the Church, in particular the teaching of the Fourth Lateran Council, which solemnly declared that God created the material and spiritual order from nothing and with time? Much is at stake in this issue, namely the ultimate metaphysical intelligibility of the universe. Without God as first cause, there is just random emergence as the basis of reality. As far back as the post-apostolic period, there is written testimony that Catholic Christians professed faith in a doctrine that God is the creator of the world, that God created from nothing, that God created directly without secondary causes, and that God created the universe with time. The ante-Nicene Fathers unambiguously articulated this faith. Belief in the Creator is a clear indicator throughout the 2nd century in distinguishing Orthodox Christian belief from Gnostic error, especially in the writings of St. Irenaeus. For example, a lucid, developed doctrine is seen in the writings of Hippolytus of Rome around the year 230. Now we'll say a word about my research approach. A number of scholars have already begun to analyze Ian Barbour's thought from the disciplinary perspectives of religious studies, Protestant theology, and philosophy. A brief review of this work is provided in Chapter 1 of my book. In the Catholic world, Sister Anne Clifford, CSJ, briefly examines some aspects of Barbour's thought as they relate to Catholicism in a 2004 book published in a Festschrift dedicated to Barbour. This essay was later republished in a 2017 issue of the journal Theology and Science. In 10 pages, she presents elements of Barbour's writings as they relate to the Galileo affair, St. John Paul II's perspective on the science-theology interaction, and Barbour's theological anthropology as it relates to Catholic interpretations of the theory of evolution. Clifford's article is a helpful start to a Catholic evaluation of Barbour's theology. However, her work helped me to realize that much more research was necessary. This book offers a very in-depth Catholic investigation of Barbour's thought. I evaluate Barbour's work according to fundamental theological criteria. A major concern of Catholic systematic theology is the relationship between faith and reason. Faith-seeking understanding requires philosophically appropriate foundations, especially in the areas of epistemology and metaphysics. Catholic theology is intimately connected with foundational philosophical concepts, such as God as self-subsistent being. In addition, philosophical concepts like consubstantiality help illumine revealed truths, like the Son's equality to the Father. Theology is established upon a rigorous philosophical realism that acknowledges the simple actuality of being precedes the knowing of any particular human subject. Realism thus prevents us from reducing truth, and all truth for that matter, to revealed truth, and all truth for that matter, to a projection of the human subject. Monsignor Thomas Garino points out in his book, Foundations of Systematic Theology, that Catholic theology requires certain theoretical exigencies in order to give its doctrinal claims architectonic structure and logical intelligibility. He argues convincingly that some metaphysical horizon is necessary, some first philosophy essential if the characteristics attributed to Christian doctrine by both the universal church and a wide range of individual theologians, such as its universality, continuity, and material identity, are not simply asserted without philosophical support. In this light, I thoroughly evaluate Barbour's Whiteheadian process thought, its implications for the doctrine of God, the Creator, the creation of man, the problem of panentheism, and the perfection of God are given particular focus. I show that a metaphysically justified doctrine of God and creation relies on the metaphysical notion of causality and certain ontological concepts such as substance and essence. Systematic theology is also concerned with the Word of God, written and transmitted in the Church. Related to this, it is interested in the notion of religious experience, its relationship to revelation, its interpretation, and its role in theological inquiry. In addition, systematic theology explores the uses of paradigms, analogy, and models. Analogy enjoys a place of particular importance given its role in the faith-reason interaction. It is a point of contact between the natural and supernatural revelation, and therefore influences our discourse on the divine. The foundational biblical concept of the obedience of faith is essential as well. So I evaluate Barbour in all these areas. Throughout this research, substantial reference is made to Saint Thomas Aquinas, a Catholic monument to the doctrine of creation. And more generally, Thomas is a model of the enriching interaction of natural philosophy, metaphysics, and revealed theology. At times, I cite Aquinas at length as his eloquence and succinctness is beyond compare in this area. By judging Barbour's works according to the aforementioned fundamental criteria of Catholic theology, I show the ramifications of his work. Of particular interest is the possibility for his philosophical foundations and theological methodology to enrich the dialogue and integration between the Catholic doctrine of creation and the natural sciences. Throughout this book, I provide answers to questions such as, how can Barbour help Catholics relate the doctrine of creation to the natural sciences? Where are his ideas problematic? How can these problems nevertheless unveil something of the truth? Barbour will not likely be affecting the development of doctrine, but can he aid in deepening our understanding of doctrine? Now a word about the structure of the book. My first chapter offers a summary of significant biographical information for Barbour. Subsequently, I present an overview of Barbour's early work as a physicist. Chapter 1 continues with a presentation of Barbour's fourfold typology for the interaction of theology and science: conflict, independence, dialogue, and integration. Finally, I describe his influence on some other prominent scholars in the field of theology and science, who both further develop his thought and in other areas take a contrasting approach. In Chapter 2, I examine the personal, philosophical, and theological influences that played a substantial role in the development of Barbour's approach to theology and science. I identify and explicate Barbour's fundamental axioms and insights. His epistemology, critical realism, and his metaphysics, process thought, are creative proposals for the theology-science interaction, so they are presented clearly and fairly. Barbour's motivations for and applications of these philosophies are made manifest. Chapter 3 describes similarities and differences between theology and science according to Barbour. This analysis begins by examining approaches taken in scientific materialism, fundamentalism, neo-orthodoxy, existentialist philosophy, and linguistic analysis that Barbour characterizes as emphasizing contrasting perspectives on science and theology. Next, I present approaches that Barbour finds helpful in relating theology and science. Neo-Thomism, mainline Protestant liberal theology, and process thought emphasize conceptual and methodological parallels according to Barbour. After that, I explicate Barbour's perspectives on theological and scientific experience and interpretation, the role of religious and scientific communities in paradigm formation, the use of analogies and models in theological and scientific language, and some criteria for evaluating religious beliefs and scientific theories. Similarities between theology and science according to Barbour with regard to data, coherence, and comprehensiveness, as well as differences on the influence of interpretation on experience, criteria of evaluation, and intersubjective testability are also explored. Chapter 4 is dedicated to a thorough evaluation of Barbour's epistemic, metaphysical, and theological principles. This assessment begins with an analysis of Barbour's critical realism in relation to other forms of critical realism as well as non-critical realisms, such as those utilized in Catholic theology and the empirical sciences. For example, the Hungarian-American philosopher of science of happy memory, Father Stanley Yaki's moderate methodical realism. Next, I evaluate Barbour's use of Whiteheadian process metaphysics. Barbour developed these philosophical foundations because he saw them as appropriate for use in the natural sciences as well as theology, and therefore helpful for a fruitful interaction of the two disciplines. Theologians must embark on a journey of discernment around the appropriateness of a particular philosophy for use in Catholic theology. A Catholic theologian should ensure that a philosophy brought to bear in theology is indeed compatible with the Catholic faith and has the possibility of offering an even deeper understanding of the Word of God, found in the inspired Scriptures and handed on by the living tradition of the Church. Chapter 4 also critically engages issues that were introduced in Chapter 3, such as the role of experience in theology, the notion of paradigms in theology, and the role of analogy. Throughout the chapter, I analyze Barbour's positions on key issues in systematic theology. Based on the evaluation of Barbour's thought in Chapter 4, the final chapter, Chapter 5, investigates where and how Barbour's approach can facilitate dialogue and integration between the Catholic doctrine of creation and the natural sciences. According to the interaction typology of dialogue, I explore two issues: presuppositions and limit questions in theology and science, as well as methodological and conceptual parallels. Within the integration typology, I investigate the role of natural theology, Barbour's notion of a theology of nature, and the possibility of a systematic synthesis of theology and science through a common metaphysics. This final chapter offers some conclusions in the form of summations of the positive and negative aspects of Barbour's thought from the perspective of the Catholic tradition. That is, where he makes a real contribution, as well as where his approach is not helpful. An aspect of this is where Barbour was a prophet, and where he failed to see difficulties. I then closed the book by describing possible paths for future Barbour studies. As mentioned earlier, the principal contribution of this book is an evaluation of the implications of Barbour's insights for the Catholic doctrine of creation's interaction with the natural sciences. Some final thoughts. All things considered, I show that from a Catholic perspective, Ian Barbour makes a significant contribution to the interaction of theology and natural science. Indeed, Barbour's perspicuous goal throughout his life as a scholar was to promote a mutually enriching relationship between the two fields. His typologies of dialogue and integration offer a generally helpful guide for relating the Catholic doctrine of creation with physical cosmology and other sciences. Barbour's knowledge of the natural sciences, particularly physics, is very up to date, and his analysis of scientific issues is unquestionably methodical and logical. This expertise allows him to introduce the science of theology to many academics in the fields of the physical and biological sciences. Barbour is a highly original thinker, with a mind untrammeled by convention. He distinguishes himself in his dedication to a wide-ranging dialogue and a culture of encounter, to use Pope Francis' terms, as well as a commitment to interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary approaches to research. The work of Ian Barbour is indeed prescient, especially in his insistence on realism in theology and science, as well as his promotion of a systematic synthesis of the fields through a common metaphysics. On this issue, Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger writes, "To separate religion, belief in God, from objective truth is to fail to recognize its innermost nature." In a period when it was fashionable to abandon realism in science in favor of idealism, instrumentalism, and positivism, as well as completely dismiss first philosophy, Barbour merits enthusiastic praise. With his critical realism, he affirms man's ability to come to know objective truth, albeit imperfectly and partially. I concur with the Irish-American philosopher of science, Father Ian McMullen, that the aspect of Barbour's critical realism, emphasizing the approximation of reality in a cumulative sense, is more applicable to sciences like physics and chemistry, not Catholic theology. In a Catholic theological context, a more robust realism, such as that of Gilson, Barbour's favorite Thomist, is preferred. Barbour would likely concur with Gilson that being precedes any one human subject and cannot be delimited by it. Yet, on the other hand, the truth of created being only comes to light in man. Thus, there is an asymmetrical reciprocity. Barbour's reliance on the metaphysical systems of Alfred North Whitehead and Charles Hartshorne is in serious tension, if not incompatibility, with traditional Christian doctrine on several key points. Barbour's denial of the biblical teaching of creation ex nihilo, from nothing, his theological anthropology, his implicit panentheism, the theological consequences of neglecting substances and essences, and his denial of the perfection of God all flow from his metaphysics. Nonetheless, with his process thought, despite the aforementioned difficulties, Barbour demonstrates the relevance of ontology, identity, and change, causality, as well as necessity and contingency in theology and science. Barbour should be commended for his perseverance in the face of critique from non-foundationalist postmodern thinkers. Again, as Monsignor Guarino points out, quote, Christian doctrine needs some kind of commodious metaphysical approach in order to support logically its claims to be universal, perduring, self-same, and normative, end quote. Barbour's appreciation of metaphysics for the rationality of theology and science, for example, the ability to make truth claims, places him in good company with Catholic theologians. Ian Barbour's metaphysician Alfred North Whitehead acknowledges that the two strongest forces which influence men are the forces of religious intuitions and the force of our impulse to accurate observation and logical deduction. He later writes, quote, when we consider what religion is for mankind and what science is, it is no exaggeration to say that the future course of history depends upon the decision of this generation as to the relation between them, end quote. It is my hope that this endeavor at a Catholic evaluation of Ian Barbour's thought according to fundamental theological criteria for the doctrine of creation contributes to the work of evangelization at the service of peace. As the Church continues her pilgrim journey toward the fullness of the kingdom, I pray that this research contributes to passage of the people of God, as Cardinal Newman put it, ex umbris et imaginibus in veritatem. Thank you.
We have ample time now, everyone, for questions and answers. So do please raise your hand. I have a microphone, and I can bring it to you so that you can ask your question. We also, for our Zoom viewers, have the opportunity to raise some questions as well. I'll bring the microphone to you. Just raise your hand and introduce yourself and ask your question.
Hello, Father, and thank you so much for your talk. You mentioned pretty consistently throughout this notion of analogy. I'm wondering, both in terms of the Catholic Church, but also in terms of Barbour's thought, is there a way of knowing God outside of mere analogy?
Great question. So, through the analogy of being within the discipline of natural theology, we contemplate God the Creator. I like comparing it to when you see a work of art, you have insight into the artist. So analogy allows us to have insights into the mystery of God in that way, although that's a very partial, imperfect way, which is elevated by supernatural revelation, by divine revelation in scriptures and transmitted through the tradition. So in the Catholic theological tradition, we strongly affirm natural theology, the use of analogy as a way to know God, supplemented, enriched by revelation, supernatural revelation. Unfortunately, Ian Barbour is generally down on natural theology, and that comes likely from the fact that he studied theology at Yale Divinity School. And at the time, there was a very strong neo-Orthodox movement influenced by the Protestant theologian Karl Barth, who saw the analogy of being as the Antichrist, as the reason why Barth would not become Catholic. So for Barth and for the neo-Orthodox movement, it's only the Bible. You cannot know God without the Bible. But in the Catholic tradition of reason and revelation, we take both together. And as you point out well, the analogy is one of the key instruments with only the tools of pure reason. Thank you.
Our next question comes to us via Zoom from Sarah Bruno. She writes, "Thank you for the wonderful talk. Can you please comment on the mystery of the transubstantiation in the context of the intersection of science and faith?
Great question. So, transubstantiation is our Catholic doctrine explaining the conversion of the substance of the bread and wine used in the Eucharist into the body and blood of Christ. The accidents, the external qualities of bread and wine remain, but the substance is converted into the body and blood of the risen Lord Jesus. And this Catholic doctrine draws deeply upon the Thomistic tradition, the Thomistic Aristotelian categories. And in our contemporary era, many people are asking questions like this excellent student or participant. And a book just came out on this topic by Dr. Stacy Trasancos. Dr. Trasancos is a physicist, a chemist. She's a PhD in chemistry and also a master's degree in theology. And she's written a number of books in the theology and science space. And this new book in particular addresses how do we bring together our understanding of natural science and our Catholic doctrine of the Eucharist. And I think an aspect of that is even investigating some of the extraordinary Eucharistic miracles that have happened throughout history. For example, moments when a priest has doubted the real presence, and in that moment, the Blessed Sacrament bleeds in his hands at the consecration, and those miracles have been preserved in Italy and elsewhere. So it's a large area to get into, and I think maybe the best answer is to refer you to Dr. Trasancos' book for a more detailed analysis. But these are the types of questions that I think we as Catholics, particularly we as Catholics, who are students, who are faculty, who are people that have the privilege to think and reflect, should be getting into. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Father, for your talk. I want to ask how Ian Barbour understands or defines theology and science. I think there is a kind of common sense way we understand the spheres of each, but I think some of the more recent work in the philosophy of science, for example, is challenging how, like, a lot of the common sense views of science we have are views we inherit from the 19th century when there was a very limited view of what science is and what it can do. Like a post-Descartesian, post-scientific revolution view of science is the kind of normative view we have, versus I don't think that would be the view of science that, let's say, St. Albert the Great would have, or St. Thomas would have. So how does Ian Barbour treat these two terms, two concepts, and how should we, as Catholics, properly understand the sphere of each?
Excellent questions. So Barbour was an experimental physicist. He did his doctorate in the early 1950s at the University of Chicago. And that experience, particularly studying under some of the contributors to the Manhattan Project, was very formative for him. So his paradigm comes out of that mid-20th century experimental school. So from a philosophy of science perspective, he would not be getting into some of the issues that occupy philosophy of science now, which we could say are largely sociological. In terms of theology, he often actually broadens that beyond probably the scope that you and I would, in that he considers religion as a phenomenon in general. And so part of that is the academic study of religion, of faith, faith-seeking understanding, but also at times he gets into related issues such as ritual, prayer, aspects of the broader study of religion that may or may not fit in the traditional scope of academic theology. So what he's really bringing together is that experimental physicist mindset, post-Manhattan project. His particular area was studying cosmic rays, and then bringing that into dialogue with this Anglophonic Protestant view of religion. And he came from a very devout family. The reason he was born in China was that his parents were lay missionaries. They moved from, in his case, father's case, Scotland. His mother was from New Jersey. They went to China to bring Christianity to the Chinese people, and his father was a professor of geology. His mother taught religious education. So there was a deep sense of Jesus, of the church, and the imperative to share that with others. Obviously a little bit different from our Catholic understanding, but probably more similar than different. So I don't know if that answers the question, but that's kind of where he's coming from. And did you have was there a second question to that? Or okay. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk, Father. I have plenty of questions, but I'll try to limit myself for the time being. I was wondering, if I heard you right, you mentioned that Barbour sees process metaphysics on the one hand and neo-Thomism on the other hand as fruitful frameworks for engaging with the natural sciences. To me, these two trains of thought seem totally in opposition, and some of the great neo-Thomists were arguing vociferously against process metaphysicians like Henri Bergson. So what is it that Barbour saw in these two opposed systems that could bring them into fruitful dialogue?
That's a great question. So he goes through this analysis, looking at all the different approaches, and I mentioned that the contrasting approaches like linguistic analysis, existentialism, fundamentalism, and then those parallel complementary approaches, and you mentioned too, process thought and neo-Thomism. For Barbour, the highest form of integration between theology and science is to have a common metaphysics. And so although neo-Thomism and process metaphysics are really incompatible and make conflicting claims about the most fundamental nature of reality, they both offer ways to have a comprehensive systematic synthesis. And unfortunately, Barbour ends up going all in on the process side. But throughout his books, he acknowledges what he sees as the positive elements of neo-Thomism, and the fact that the Thomistic approach to reality, Thomistic metaphysical realism, is very capable and well suited for supporting theology and for supporting natural science. He doesn't really give a reason why he doesn't go in that direction, other than he finds process thought most compelling. And maybe it was a timing issue that was a very hot topic, and he was personally influenced by a number of significant thinkers who were all in on process metaphysics. So it is very interesting, and you're astute to acknowledge that he sees them both as good ways to enter into the space, but they actually don't agree with each other. Thank you.
I'll pair Rhett's question with a closely related question from our Zoom audience. Thomas Cummings asks, how compatible is Barbour's interpretation of Whiteheadian metaphysics with Thomistic theology?
I'm sorry, say that one more time.
How compatible is Barbour's interpretation of Whiteheadian metaphysics with Thomistic theology?
Not compatible at all. He does, which I like very much, he does simplify Whiteheadian metaphysics because it can be really, really overly complex. So what he does is take the fundamentals of Whitehead's ontology and then try to run with it, but it cannot be reconciled with Thomistic metaphysics because he denies fundamental concepts like substances or essences. So from that perspective, it's a no-go.
Thank you, Father Laracy.
Hello, Father.
Hello, Father. Thank you for your talk. One of the major themes in your talk was the importance of having, in your words, a robust realism in this sphere. And so I had a question about how to address that from a natural sciences perspective. So, for those of us nerds who watch Aquinas 101 on YouTube, Father Dominic Legg loves to talk about dogness, the form of dogs, right? But just use that as a launching pad for my question. How do we defend the idea of realism in today's, in response to advances in modern, biology and physics, et cetera? For example, at what point can we say that a dog with a certain mutation is now a different species than all the ones that came before it? Or, you could use that with any other species. So how do we reconcile realism with these kinds of, evolutionary discoveries?
Great question. Wow, you guys don't ask easy questions. I was hoping for a few, softballs, but... So I think with realism in general, the starting point should be the intuition of being. And you see that even with a child. As the child is growing up and exploring the world around it, a child knows there are things out there. And how does the child know that? The child sees, touches, tastes, right? And it has a sense that this is not this block that I picked up and I'm licking and chewing on. This is not me. This is something else outside of me. And it's not just a dream in my mind, but it has its own act of being. It has its own existence. And this basic intuition of being historically was the basis for the emergence of natural science in the 13th, 14th centuries in Christian Europe, where a number of friars and other churchmen were reflecting deeply on the theology of creation, and that was motivating their scientific work. That was motivating the emergence of the Oxford School of Experimentation, the early work in astronomy, in mechanics, and other fields. So there's that historical fact of the motivation. And then with regard to universals, as you mentioned, like dogginess, this is the approach of moderate realism, and this was also a medieval question about what is the status of universals. Do we assert an exaggerated realism where this universal dog is somewhere to be found, or do we go to another extreme of nominalism and say that really these are just word games talking about dogginess or humanity or human nature? Because we just see singulars, we don't see universals. But the approach of moderate realism says that universal concepts do exist, and they are realized in the instantiation of particulars. So all of you are instantiations of humanity, of human nature. You're all unique, you're all particular, but you make present humanity. So when we get into questions of biology and evolution, a matter that arises early on is how do we understand speciation from the notion of form? And one way to do that is that you have accidental changes to organisms over time as they evolve, but during one sexual act between male and female of a species, there is a substantial change in which the offspring is now a new substantial form, and that we could call a new species. So that's just one hypothetical way to think about speciation in terms of substance and accidents, that the accidental changes are preparing the way for that key moment of speciation where there is a substantial change when the sperm and the egg come together and there is a new organism. But this is certainly an area which you probably see from those great videos from the Thomistic Institute that is a very much a contemporary area of research. So, and there are good articles on it, but we can't say, okay, here's the answer, just read this. So hopefully you can contribute to this in your own reflection on it. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcus. Hi, thanks, Father Laracy. I was interested in how you were speaking about the role of scientific and religious communities in paradigm formation, and I'm interested in the history of science, and I was interested in sort of whether Barbour was interested in Thomas Kuhn and his ideas about normal science and incommensurability. So most scientists are doing normal science, and then there's sort of a moment when there's incommensurability, and then there's a paradigm shift. And I guess I was just interested in sort of how paradigms and paradigm shifts in science relate to paradigm shifts in theology, and sort of like the dynamics of change in science and theology. And yeah, what sort of happens to a sense of any common metaphysical ground when there's shifts in science?
Great question, and you're absolutely right that he is very influenced by Thomas Kuhn and Kuhn's thesis that you basically have normal science schlepping along, making incremental advances, and then there is the paradigm shift moment, maybe going from Newtonian to Einsteinian physics, or Newtonian to quantum mechanics, or whatever it may be. But then there's this jump, and then you have the incremental development again. So he basically goes all in on that in terms of the science side. He also largely goes in on it for the religion side, but this can become very problematic, because what does it mean to do a paradigm shift with doctrine, right? In the Catholic tradition, we can have new approaches to interpretation, new methodologies in science, semantic approaches, but we don't speak about paradigmatic shifts in revelation in itself, right? We're not going to, in a year or 100 years, say there's 4 persons in the Holy Quaternity or something like that. And he realizes he's got to be careful, but I don't think he's careful enough, because what he says is that religion, Christianity, has a core set of beliefs which is not changeable, and then everything else can be radically changed by a paradigm shift. But he restricts the radius of the essentials to something way too small. Basically, God is love, which is the foundational concept in Christianity. Deus caritas est, God is love. That's a doctrine, that's in Revelation. But anything outside of that, he thinks is very negotiable. So the divinity and humanity of Christ and how we understand that, like the great question about the doctrine of the Eucharist, he would see these as all highly reformable based on this Kuhnian paradigm. So that's where I critique him there, that from a Catholic perspective, we can't go down that road. The core issues are much longer than God's, much broader than God is love.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for your talk. I'm curious, if we think about the state of science right now, it sort of seems like there's just sort of an assumed nominalism, and I'm curious what you think would happen if metaphysics and potentially even religious belief were taken seriously within science. Would it mean that sort of the same exact process would take place with the scientific method, but we're not going to rule out God now? Or like, what would it actually look like to live out a science practice that took seriously metaphysics?
Great question. And Barbour does get into this in his writings, because he, in order to justify realism and metaphysics, in his case ultimately process, but metaphysics in general, he offers critiques of other philosophies of science or other kind of first philosophies, and I think they're quite compelling. He critiques positivism, he critiques instrumentalism, idealism, other forms of neo-Kantian thought, and he shows how these are incompatible with the historical development of science, how they're detrimental to advancing science, and because in the case of something like instrumentalism, he basically says these are just, you're playing word games. If you're not making a claim that this is an objective reality, but only a description of something which may or may not exist and may or may not be revised, what are you doing? Are you doing real science? So in this way, he's quite classical, and it would be interesting to survey practicing scientists at places like Princeton and elsewhere to see, if you could create like an instrument to kind of tease out their implicit epistemology and metaphysics, where they fit. But Barbour himself makes a pretty strong defense for realism and for a first philosophy of metaphysics. Thank you.
Any further questions, either from our audience here in person or from Zoom? I'll maybe indulge myself and ask a quick question myself. It certainly sounded towards the end of your remarks and in some of your responses now like Barbour's epistemology comes out looking much better than his metaphysics, that his critical realism stands on better ground than his process theology or his process metaphysics. Could you comment a little further on what more Thomistically minded thinkers or scientists might have to gain from that critical realism?
Well, in the book, I am critical of critical realism because of what I see as the surrender to certain Kantian presuppositions. Barbour's critical realism, at the end of the day, cannot make absolute truth claims, which in Catholic theology we must be able to do. Right? Again, the Trinity example. We must insist that based on revelation, based on the Holy Scriptures, God is three persons with one nature, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Our philosophy of knowledge can't admit that this could be thrown out. And the revisability of theories from science, he's always trying to insert that into theology. And so when he articulates his critical realism, which he doesn't articulate in a formal way as a philosopher would, you have to kind of tease it out from examples and arguments, but it does manifest itself. It makes too many compromises to our ability to come to know with certainty. And one of the qualities of faith, supernatural faith, is certitude. So that's an area where he would differ with a Thomistic approach, a Catholic approach.
Thank you very much. Any final questions? Okay, well then, thank you for joining.